Um, hello everybody. Welcome to a new year of classes. My name is Mukta and I'm going to be teaching the science curriculum for this year. I taught it last year as well for 4th grade and I really enjoyed it last year. Obviously, I made some mistakes last year. I'm hoping to improve on the things that I covered last year and maybe cover new information this year as well. Uh, so before we get into it, since this is the first class for science, it is gonna be kind of more easier, I guess. It's just gonna be kind of like an intro class. We're not gonna be doing a lot of learning. It's just like a mini unit is kind of what we're gonna be covering first. But before I get into it, I want to talk about some rules that everybody should follow as they're listening along to these streams for at least my class. One is that you guys should be prepared. You should have at least your notebook or a pencil, a piece of paper and a pencil to take notes if you don't understand anything, or if you want to write down questions that you can ask in like the upcoming study hall classes, or that you want to ask your teachers. I also want everybody to be respectful, so nobody should be talking while the teacher is teaching, or if your classmates are asking a question, you shouldn't be talking over them. Also, yeah, honestly, like have fun. This is meant so that you guys understand like what you like. Maybe you want to be a scientist when you grow up. So this is all just for you guys so that you can learn more stuff in a more engaging way. So without further ado, I think we can start our presentation. So we're gonna focus our unit 1, or unit 0 kind of technically, is going to be the scientific method. I'm thinking it's going to be a 2-day lesson type of unit, because the first lesson is just going to be me teaching about the different aspects of the scientific method, and then I'm going to give you guys homework. It's going to be very simple homework where I'll get into it at the end of the presentation. And then next lesson, hopefully I can do an experiment. I can show you guys an experiment, and you guys can watch that. If I'm not able to do that, we will have a new unit. But for now, I think we may have, yeah, it's going to be a 2-day lesson for now. That's what I think. So, yeah, once again, Big Sushi Foundation, the 4th grade team, and basically the scientific method is how scientists find answers. This is like a fundamental concept that you'll need across all your science subjects, whether that be biology, physics, chemistry, earth science. So the scientific method is essential, and this is what actual real life scientists use when they are conducting experiments and creating cures and researching interesting things that hopefully you guys will also be doing after you understand how to do it in this lesson. Okay. So our learning objectives, like at the end of this lesson, students should be able to identify the basic steps of the scientific method, ask scientific questions and make simple predictions, make careful observations during experiments. So there's 3 objectives. Basically, what are the steps of the scientific method? What does each step entail? What are some questions and predictions that young scientists can make? And lastly, making careful observations using the values recorded in the experiment and during the experiment. So what is the scientific method. The scientific method is a way scientists learn about the world. It helps us solve problems, answers questions, and answer questions, and make discoveries. We can all be scientists when we follow these steps. So I'm going to get into the steps. After I cover why we actually use a scientific method. We use a scientific method to help us solve problems, make science fair and accurate, ensure repeatable experiments, and keep steps in order. The big thing about the scientific method is that if one scientist is researching an issue and they come across an answer, the idea is that the experiment which they use to get that answer should be repeatable, because that's how we can ensure that their logic and reasoning and whatever the conclusion they draw is accurate, it's right, it's correct, it's the truth. So that's why we need to be able to make sure it's repeatable. And when we conduct an experiment, it has to support the conclusions of any other previous scientists who also conducted the same experiment. And to make sure that these experiments are repeatable, we use a scientific method because they're an order that all the scientists follow. It's the same order, everybody follows the same order. So that's the big idea there. So the first thing that you want to do, So the first thing a scientist must do is to ask a question and do background research. So the question can be anything about like, what do you want to know, or what do you want to learn? What is interesting in your house? Like, why does the sun shine? Like, it can be any question that you want to learn more about. For example, here I give an example. What causes a plant to grow tall? So you guys may not know this, but we'll cover this later in the year. But for a question like what causes a plant to grow tall, instead of searching it up on Google, we can conduct an experiment. And this experiment will help prove what causes a plant to grow tall. And sometimes you will need to do background research, obviously not like searching the answer to your experiment, but maybe what type of plants are there, what type of plants are there, what type of soil do they use, kind of figuring out all these background information that could be essential in aiding when creating your actual experiment. So after we create a question that is about our topic that we want to dive more into, then you have to create a hypothesis. A hypothesis is your best guess. It's like a prediction. It's educated prediction. It's a statement you can test. This is what you're actually testing with your experiment. For example, if I give plants more sunlight, then they will grow taller. So we're saying that sunlight is what causes a plant to grow taller. So if we increase the amount of sunlight, then they will grow taller. Or if we give plants more sunlight, then they will grow taller. That is what we're saying. Basically, in a hypothesis, to make it a hypothesis, it's an if and then statement. The if is what you're going to change. Like, it's like, if I do this, then something will happen. So it always has to have an if and then. Sometimes when you guys are more, when you guys go to like more advanced levels, it will be a if, then, and because statement. So if I give plants more sunlight, then they will grow taller because sunlight allows them to do photosynthesis. That's a if, then, because. The because is a scientific reasoning. Why does that occur? Or why do you think it will occur? The thing with the hypothesis is that it doesn't have to be right. It doesn't have to be entirely true. Like, even though it is true that if I give plants more sunlight, they will grow taller, it doesn't necessarily have to be true, because that's the entire point of the experiment, to figure out if that statement is correct or not. So once again, a hypothesis is a statement you can test. So when conducting your experiment, we're going out. So let me repeat the steps. So far, we talked about the first is asking a question, doing background research, then making a hypothesis based on what you research or what your question is about, and then you're going to go into the experiment. But before we do the experiment, it's always important to have our safety first. And these are some rules and regulations so that you can stay safe. I only listed a couple here, like the most important ones, but there are many things that you should do, and these are just a few. So you always have to wear PPE. That's what they call it, PPE, personal protective equipment. And these are like gloves, goggles, and a lab coat. And the gloves are not like your mittens. It's like gloves that are specifically used for scientific purposes. So these are scientific gloves, scientific goggles, and a lab coat. And the lab coat is kind of like your regular coat, but it's much more long, and it's white usually, and it has a lot of pockets. But basically, it protects you so that if any chemicals are spilt on you in the event of like when you're doing an experiment, it's not getting on your clothes. So that's why we always have to wear PPE. And similarly, whenever you're doing an experiment, you always have to wear closed-toed shoes. So you can't be wearing Crocs, you can't be wearing your sandals, you have to be wearing tennis shoes, preferably, or something that covers your entire foot, so that once again, if you're dropping like a chemical, you're dropping a glass or something, you accidentally drop it, then it doesn't hurt you. These are all for your safety so that you're healthy and you can conduct the experiment efficiently, but also safely, right? So you're not supposed to directly smell chemicals. Whenever you want to record an observation about a chemical, you're supposed to waft it. What is wafting? It's basically when, imagine you have a beaker, and in the beaker there's a chemical, maybe like isopropyl or alcohol. Then you can waft it by gently, instead of sticking your entire nose into the beaker, which is a scientific equipment. It's kind of like a scientific glass, but for chemicals, and specifically designed so that there's like a measuring scale on it and everything. You can gently push the smell of whatever chemical is in there and gently direct it to your nose so that you can smell it, but you're not getting the full force effect of the chemical. And you're not supposed to be eating or drinking during an experiment. So you should never be eating or drinking during an experiment, where that's like chewing gum or you're eating your biscuit or something like that. You cannot be doing that. And it's even more important that you never eat or drink anything in the experiment. Like, you should not be drinking chemicals. You should not be putting your mouth to any of the equipment. You're only supposed to use equipment what their intended purpose is, okay? That's the main idea. So not even drinking water or anything. If you want to drink water, you have to step away from the lab area and you have to quietly drink the water. So that means that no horseplay. What is horseplay? Running around, knocking things over. That is not allowed, and that can be very, very dangerous. So that no horseplay is one of the really important rules. And then always follow directions and ask for help necessary. In any case, if you're ever confused about a step, rather than trying to do it by yourself, always ask a grown-up or ask your lab partners. And this is very important, okay? And then lastly, always clean up spills and other materials. So if you knock down a beaker, and it's a glass beaker, what you should do is inform your teacher, first of all, because you should never directly touch the glass. And once you inform your teacher will either direct you to tell you like what you have to do, like maybe she's going to give you a broom and something else to clean it up, or she or he will do it by themselves. And this is so that you're not touching anything and without like wearing your gloves, or like it's just for your safety. So these are important things that you should follow. In my school, if we are not following any of these things during a lab, we are not allowed to participate in it. And that's always not fun because labs are very fun. Creating experiments and trying them out is very, very fun. So yeah, that's an important thing. Okay, now that we covered everything before an experiment, now we're talking about factors in an experiment. To keep an experiment consistent, there are a couple of steps scientists have to take. This is where variables, things that can change an experiment, come into play. So you might be wondering why I said like consistent things, but then I'm talking about variables which can change. So I'm gonna explain that because that can be kind of confusing. So these are just what the terms are called. Independent variable, the one thing you choose to change in an experiment. Given our previous hypothesis, it's like, if I give plants more sunlight, then they will grow taller. That is what we're going to change, the amount of sunlight. So that's our independent variable. What we are changing, what we're actively trying to figure out what the effect, what we're actively trying to change to figure out the effect of our experiment. So the independent variable is the thing we change. That's all you have to remember. The amount of sunlight given to a plant. The dependent variable, however, is kind of like the opposite of the independent variable. It's what we observe or measure because of the change. Because of the independent variable, the dependent variable, what happens to the dependent variable? And you can kind of tell because the independent is like what we change, dependent's dependent on the independent variable. That's kind of how you have to look at the wordplay. And in our experiment, the example experiment I'm talking about throughout these steps is how tall the plant gets because of the independent variable. So in every experiment, at least at your level, we can only be changing one independent variable. So everything else has to be the exact same. That's what I mean when they have to be consistent. So the constants are everything you keep exactly the same so the test is fair, like the type of plant and the amount of water and the soil. These are all things that you have to keep exactly the same. So the only thing we're changing is the amount of sunlight to observe the dependent variable, which is how tall the plant gets. Does that make sense? I hope that does. And then the control it's usually like a group or it's a baseline or unchanged sample used as a standard for comparison against your experimental results, like a regular plant which was treated as normal. So maybe if in our experiments to measure the amount of sunlight given to a plant, we can have an experiment where the sunlight is increased, like you spend like a plant. How about a hibiscus plant? You put it in sunlight for 1 hour. And then you do it for 2 hours. And then you take a different plant and you do it for 3 hours. So you're changing the plant, obviously, but the other, you're keeping the same type of plant, but you're changing the amount of hours that plant is sitting under the sun. And if this was our independent variable where the sunlight given to the plant and how tall each of the plants get, and the constants are like the same type of plant, the same type of water is used, like the same amount of water, same amount of soil, same type of soil, then the control would be maybe one that you regularly put on your desk. Maybe it gets sunlight, maybe it doesn't, but that's the control. That's what we treat as normal. So if you usually put it in the shade, maybe that plant is usually in the shade. So that's like your control group. It's what you're comparing your other plants, the ones that you change with like the independent variable, to. So you can see the difference. That's the idea between a control group. So a control group is not the constants. There's two different things. That's what you have to remember. Constants are what you keep same in the same test, and control is like a set used as a baseline. So now it's time to test your hypothesis. You'll follow steps carefully, the procedure you have written down, observe what happens, and keep everything fair. So I forgot to mention this, but this part of the experiment is called the method, or and in the method, it's where we talk about the variables, right? These are the variables I talked about. The procedure, which are the step-by-step steps. So like, first, water the plant. Second, put the plant in sunlight. Third, count the number, like put a stopwatch next to the plants and count the amount of hours it's in the sunlight. And that's the procedure, which is all part of the method. The method also includes materials. So before you're doing an experiment, it's important that you keep track of all these things so that when you actually do the experiment, it runs smoothly, you know what you're doing, everything is working correctly. And it's also important that you keep track of what materials you'll need to buy, what you need to ask your science teachers for. And that's part of the method. Okay, so now we're going to imagine that we conducted the experiment and we got some data from the experiment with the plants, right? We found out that, I'm just going to give an example, the plant that was sitting in the sunlight for 1 hour grew maybe 2 centimeters, while the one that was sitting in the sunlight for 5 hours grew 3 centimeters. So we kind of see, well, the idea is that that's what our experiment showed. The experiment gave those results. And you have to record your data, basically tracking what the experiment is showing you. So write down your observation, measure and take notes, use charts, drawings, graphs, anything to like visually kind of take a snapshot of what's happening. And it's always important to be honest and accurate. You don't want to mess anything up. You don't want to fib the numbers or something just so that it follows a certain pattern. The idea is that in your experiment, you don't have to get an accurate answer. You know what I mean? I'm saying it only has to be an honest experiment so that you're following the steps exactly. You're minimizing human error, so you're not doing anything that can cause the error, which means you're following everything precisely, using rulers like to measure stuff, and that's the idea. And you can also take photos, videos, recordings. All of these are good ways to record your data, and I've used them before. And there's different types of data. There's quantitative data, usually comes from what was measured with tools and is much easier to put into the charts or graphs mentioned in the step. So quantitative data could be the observable numbers. This kind of quantitative data is all about numbers, right? And when I talked about the 1 centimeter increase, that's what you can put into a chart or into a graph, right? So that is quantitative data. Qualitative data is usually something that's more subjective, which means it's kind of more opinions based, if you will. It comes from what was observed with senses like your touch, your sight, your smell, hearing, tasting. Obviously, you should not be tasting anything. And if you're smelling, obviously waft. But I'm just giving examples of your 5 senses and what that means in qualitative data. And usually a good data contains a mixture of both quantitative and qualitative. But I'm just giving you examples of what they are so that in an experiment where there might not be quantitative data, you can take qualitative data, and if you can't take qualitative data, then you can take quantitative data. Both are viable aspects of data collection. The next step is to actually analyze your data or analyze the results. So look at the data you collected. Did anything surprise you? Can you see patterns? This helps you decide if your hypotheses were correct or not. So maybe in our previous example, I talked about, I'm not really sure if I think I said in 1 hour, your plant grew 2 centimeters, and then in 5 hours in sunlight, your plant grew 3 centimeters. So did you notice any patterns? Did this information, what you collected, the data you collected, did it surprise you? How did you collect it? Like, did you do any calculations after you collected the data? These are all part of the results section where you're analyzing your data. And if you do it correctly, this is what's going to aid you in creating your conclusion or drawing your conclusion. So when you're drawing a conclusion, what you want to cover is what did you learn from your experiment, exactly why the results happened, was your hypothesis right or wrong? It's totally okay for it to be wrong, because even when it is wrong, you're learning something. You know that what you did wasn't right. You know that your hypothesis wasn't true. And that's one more thing that you for sure know is not true. So you can focus on all the other things that may be true. So even if you feel like, oh, my hypothesis wasn't true, then my experiment was a waste, that's not the case. And then think about what you would do differently next time. So maybe you learned that photosynthesis does occur when sunlight comes because of your plant experiment. So that's why your plants grow taller. Maybe that's what you learned. And then you can explain why exactly that happened, why the result happened, what is the scientific reasoning behind it. This is where you could do a lot of your background research, where you're understanding how this actually affects everyday people, right? You're trying to see the impact of your hypothesis and your conclusion or of your experiment. How is this affecting you and me? How is this affecting people maybe in Africa, maybe in India? Like, how is it affecting people in general? And then you have to think about what you would do differently next time. Maybe there were sources of error. When I'm talking about error, um, obviously, you have to factor in that there's always going to be some amount of error, but you want to minimize human error. So maybe you do more trials. Doing more trials, like more rounds of the same data collection, is going to minimize any outliers, which are how can I explain outliers? Outliers are things that you usually don't get, but in one case, in one of the data collection, one of your data values is totally higher than the rest of your data values. By repeating trials, you can minimize outliers, because what we want to happen ideally is that across all of our trials, across all of our experiments, we're getting the same reading, we're getting the same conclusion, we're drawing the same hypothesis. That's what we want when we're repeating experiments. So one way to do that is to do more trials, do the trials for longer maybe, or yeah, there's a variety of ways to do it based on the mistakes you made in the first experiment. So once you draw your conclusion and you feel like, oh, it's not good, you can obviously do the experiment again. There's nothing stopping you from only doing it once. That's kind of what I want to cover. So here we have an example video. Um, I'll come back to this after I cover homework, I think. Yeah, this was a very short lesson, that's what I was saying. Um, so I'm gonna go to homework. So for homework, what I created was a template, your experiment template, that I kind of want you guys to use. So maybe you can write it down, um, or your teachers can print it for you. So this is fourth grade science, you know what, lesson 1 homework. I'm going to put this in the drive, in the Dixuchi fourth grade drive. So create your own experiments. Your homework is going to be to create your own experiment. So you write your name, your date, the date, research question, something you are curious about, background information, optional for you guys. I'm not going to make it a requirement, but it's obviously good to have some amount of background information. So maybe you can ask Google, use Google, which is search engine, and look at some articles, or go to the library and read books on it, or maybe anything. Really, you can use any reliable source for background information. Reliable sources are sources that are recent, so not in the 1900s, right? We want something recent, maybe in the 2000. I would say only use sources that are at max from 2010. Like before that, the reliability reduces. We don't know how truthful those sources are, how will be scientists constantly are conducting experiments and making new discoveries. So yeah. And make sure the author is someone you trust, like someone who is reputable, meaning they have a lot of credibility. They're very well known, maybe, or they do a lot of research in the field and are known for being popular in that field. And then you create your hypothesis, if then statements only. Make sure you're always using an if then statement. If you want to do a challenge, maybe write a because. And then experiment what you're going to test. So you're going to talk about, so this is what you're defining your experiment. The experiment would be, for example, would be measuring how sunlight affects plant growth. That is your experiment. Just has to be a single sentence, right? I'm not expecting you guys to write a bunch, right? A single sentence, couple of words. I'm not even expecting full sentences, okay? I'm just expecting you guys to write statements. This is like a really simple homework. Don't want to give you guys a lot. And then write your independent variables. You can just list them out. Dependent variables, your constants, your controls. Materials you'll need, like lab goggles, water, pencil, etc. Procedure, what are the steps to follow for this experiment? Need to be repeatable. So make them very specific, right? That's the entire goal. Your procedure is to make it very specific. Make sure that nothing is left for doubt. Make your steps very specific. You can use bullet points. You can use you can number it. Really a lot of things. And then this is where your data collection comes in. Step 8, draw a chart, graph, or list qualitative data. Have all the space. Then analyze the results and the conclusion. Was your hypothesis true or not? This is, in fact, guys, the most important part of your conclusion is to figure out if the hypothesis was true or not, and what you can do to improve your experiment next time. That is what you have to remember when you're doing your conclusion. So now you know the steps to scientific method. Let's try it as a class. We'll come up with a fun question, make a hypothesis, and do a real experiment together, just like a real scientist. So that's what I was gonna do next class. I'm thinking about either doing one introducing our next unit, maybe, is what I'll probably do. But here are my citations, right? I did some background research for this slideshow, and these are my citations. I also want to cite Canva, which is what I'm using for all these images. Oh, I also forgot to mention, in this image, you can kind of see the person wearing goggles, see, wearing gloves, and also wearing a lab coat. All these little kids wearing gloves, goggles, and lab coats, right? They're all safe. But anyway, these are the citations. I do want to mention that I linked a YouTube video, a Khan Academy video, and it's gonna go more into what I covered in class if you guys want to learn more about it or do your own research about this topic. So make sure to watch it. I think I also put that as part of your homework. So make sure you're watching that. Um, okay, I just want to make sure that everything was streaming right. But we are 40-ish minutes in. I'm gonna give you guys a few minutes. If you are not printing it out, make sure to write down write down the homework in your notebook, which I'm expecting you guys have, or maybe the teachers can write it down. I'm not really sure, but I'll just give you guys a few minutes to do that. Okay, I'm just gonna scroll down. So when you guys are taking measurements, I forgot to mention, but when you guys are taking quantitative measurements or information or data based on countable measurements of something, make sure that you're using the SI units of measurements, which is the international system. In America, we use like feet, feet, inches, and that's not viable for places all across the world. So you have to be using um, centimeters, you should be using meters. This is so that scientists all across the world can read your experiments, see what measurements you took, and kind of improve, um, their experiments or utilize it too. So I'm gonna end the stream early. Hopefully everybody took note of the homework and maybe you guys can watch the video too. But that's it for this class. Next week we'll be covering either this unit or I'm gonna do the next unit, which is gonna be atoms. But in any case, make sure to complete the homework. And yeah, I'm gonna end it a bit early because it was our first lesson. Anyway, I can't wait to work with you guys next year.